This is episode 105 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm David Shazier, author of the Shakespeare Solved series of historical novels. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
But words like culverines and serpentines and demi-canons, which is a small cannon, different size cannons mounted on walls. Some of them were beginning to be mounted on ships. These were not all that new. What was new was that they were beginning to manufacture them, gun manufacturer, in sizes that you actually could carry.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Famously, William Shakespeare's globe burned down from cannon fire in 1599, and several of Shakespeare's plays mention guns, gunpowder, and bullets. While we think of Shakespeare's era as one of romantic sword battles, duels with a rapier in the streets, and even the massive naval battles that occurred with the Spanish Armada, for the life of William Shakespeare, everything was under constant invention and development of the new. It turns out the development of weapons technology was no exception, as the late 16th century saw England replace the serpentine, culverine, and demi-canon with smaller, more portable hand cannons, pistols, and muskets. While the average person on the street might not have carried these weapons regularly, we know from the burning of the Globe Theatre that cannons, at least, had a place in 16th century theater and Shakespeare's theater specifically. So does that mean guns and gunpowder did as well? Here to help us explore the advent of the handgun and portable firearms that took place in England during the life of William Shakespeare and whether or not they show up in the theater is our guest, Grace Tiffany. Grace Tiffany teaches Shakespeare and Renaissance literature at Western Michigan University and is the author of many scholarly articles and books on Shakespeare and his contemporaries, as well as 6 novels set in the early modern period. Her latest work of fiction, Gunpowder Percy, reimagines the 1605 gunpowder plot in which a group of religiously disaffected Englishmen attempted to blow up the House of Lords so as to kill the Protestant King James and his Privy Council and replace them all with a Catholic government. In the novel, and maybe in reality, it was Shakespeare's history plays staging heroic rebellion that sparked the gunpowder plot. Hello, Grace. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for having me.
We like to think of Shakespeare as the age of rapiers and daggers and sword fights. It's very romantic. And I suppose we have characters like Hamlet to thank for that image that we associate with the 16th century. But Grace, was this also the age of the handgun?
Well, the 16th century was the age of the start of the hand-carried gun. Nobody would have used the phrase handgun or even firearms. But there were guns that people were beginning to carry almost exclusively on the battlefield or else for hunting. Big guns had been in use since the 13th century. So I'm talking about cannons mounted on walls, beginning in the 16th century, maybe a little earlier to be mounted on ship decks. And those had long been part of battle. And so references to those kind of guns, that can be seen in the work of 16th century authors. Those are probably the more frequent references. So all different types and sizes of cannon were very familiar. But what was new in the 16th century was the beginning of what we would call the musket and other forms of hand-carried weapons.
Now, I know I said I wouldn't ask you a question I didn't give you time to prepare for, but I'd like to throw one in here because you just said something that surprises me. I associate the musket with the Three Musketeers, and I always assumed there was a great divide between the Carolinian period and the sort of later 17th century, and then the early 17th century where, Shakespeare was right on the cut of there. And I always thought of the musket as happening after Shakespeare's lifetime. Are you saying that there were muskets in use in England during Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yeah, well, it's a term for the hand-carried longer gun. One of several. Arquebus was another, caliber, and sometimes these words denote different types of long-barreled guns, and sometimes they're just used synonymously to mean that sort of gun, and not any kind of specific one. So yeah, in that sense, muskets were among the words used for guns that mostly soldiers were beginning to use in battle in the 16th century.
So that's why that distinction exists. The style of gun the musketeers were using might not have been used during Shakespeare's lifetime, but the musket as a concept did.
Yeah, yes. I'm sure that, gun technology was continuing to evolve and always change. So I'm sure that the guns that they were using in the middle of the 17th century, when many more people were carrying them on the field, was very different from what was in use in Shakespeare's time. But there were what we would call muskets. There were these guns.
Now, we see a gun mentioned in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which was written in 1595. What kind of gun is it that he's talking about there?
Well, it's hard to know exactly because these references to guns are metaphorical and not precise. And you're hardly ever going to actually see a gun being used on stage in Shakespeare's plays. It does happen a couple of times, a few times. It's sort of interesting when it does. But there's a couple of references to guns in Romeo and Juliet. At one point, Romeo talks about his name as it's repeated over and over by Juliet. She's wailing, Romeo, Romeo, that his name is like a bullet that's murdering her. That really doesn't tell us what kind of gun Romeo is thinking of or what the audience was thinking of when they heard that. They could be imagining a large gun because bullet was also a word that could describe a small cannonball. But I don't think the image needs to be all that precise. It's just simply this kind of interesting, striking image of the name of Romeo being as somehow as violent as a firearm, as destructive as a firearm. And there's a later reference that is a little more specific where Romeo compares their love, or someone does, his and Juliet's love, to being as violent as hasty powder fired from a cannon's wound. So there you have a reference to a big gun, but also a metaphorical reference. So overwhelmingly, the comments about guns in Shakespeare, as in the work of other authors, the guns were brought in order to describe something else, something that was going on in human relationships, and to convey this sense of something violent and explosive and immediate, but in the realm of emotion. So I guess the short answer then would be, we're not sure what kind of gun, Romeo was thinking of or Shakespeare was thinking of, but all that's important is that he was thinking of, he's using the image of a gun. He's using the image of gunpowder. That's increasingly a metaphor that was in use for Shakespeare in, I guess the time period we're talking about is, the late 1590s, mid to late 1590s and early 17th century.
Romeo and Juliet, I think, is perhaps the most famous mention of guns. But as you alluded to just now, more surprising to me are the mentions of not just guns, but gunpowder and bullets in several of Shakespeare's plays. Specifically, the Henriade plays uses the phrase gun stones that Shakespeare writes in Henry V. Grace, what were bullets made of in the 16th century? You talked about them being small cannonballs. Were they actually firing small stones at one another?
No, stones was itself a kind of metaphor for the cannonballs, and balls was also a word used to describe them. They were made of molded lead, and so they're spherical, and there were various sizes of them. So gunstones would have been a word, bullets, simply a reference to lead that comes up in a battlefield context in a play, sometimes not used metaphorically, sometimes actually a direct description of some battle weaponry that's going on, still not very frequently seen. But they're talking about what we would call cannonballs. And there were a whole different assortment of sizes of cannonballs, depending on, the size of the gun that they were being fired from. In the history plays, most of the references to guns are therefore not anachronistic, even though most of these history plays the Henry IV plays, and Henry V anyway, are set in the early 15th century for the time of the handheld gun. Most of the references are to what we would call cannon, to the big guns. And those guns were actually used at that time. So even a reference to a bullet at that time, Shakespeare isn't bringing his own late 16th century moment into those plays. In most of these references, he's actually being historically descriptive of things that were going on in the battlefield. There are a couple of interesting exceptions to that in the history plays. But in general, I think modern audiences, whenever they hear a gun referred to, they think of a gun, like a little gun, like a pistol gun, like a revolver, something like that. That wouldn't have been the immediate image that Shakespeare's audience had. They would have thought of a cannon.
One quote from Shakespeare that functions as the foundation of Grace's latest novel is the quote from Henry IV, Part 1, when Falstaff says, quote, "I am afraid of this gunpowder Percy, though he be dead, how if he should counterfeit to and rise." Grace, the gunpowder plot when Guy Fawkes was caught trying to blow up Parliament happened in 1605, which is almost a full decade after Shakespeare wrote these lines in 1597. So who is the gunpowder Percy that Falstaff is mentioning here?
That would be Hotspur, or Henry Percy, who is the valiant rebel in Henry IV, Part 1, whom Prince Hal has just slain in sword fight. And Falstaff, Hal's disreputable buddy, has been secretly watching the battle while pretending to be dead to keep himself safe. And once Prince Hal leaves the stage and Hotspur's corpse, the rebel Hotspur's corpse, is lying there on the stage, Falstaff jumps up and kind of looks at it and says, "I'm afraid of this gunpowder Percy. What if he rises up again and starts fighting again, just like I rose up again?" And it's a really weird comment, because gunpowder really has nothing to do with Hotspur. Hotspur is a late medieval knight. He's the avatar of chivalry. He fights with a broadsword, one would assume. I mean, again, this is the early 15th century. This is 1403. And it's strange, even though gunpowder existed in this time and at this time and was used to fire big guns, it's a very strange sort of metaphor to attach to this valiant sword-wielding chivalrous knight, to compare him to an explosive charge of gunpowder, that he might kind of jump up himself and start fighting again like gunpowder. So I thought it would be very interesting to explore the idea that some of the men involved in the gunpowder plot, which, as most of your listeners probably know, was a conspiracy of zealous Catholic gentlemen to blow up the Houses of Parliament with the king in attendance, King James I, the Protestant king, and to alter the Protestant form of government of England back to a Catholic one. And this plot that was foiled, it didn't happen. But I thought it would be interesting to imagine one of the key plotters, who was actually a latter-day descendant of the Percys. His last name was Percy. His name was Thomas Percy, going to see the play in 1597, going to see Shakespeare's history plays, as most of these men like to do. I mean, they were really theater aficionados, and seeing over and over, perhaps, the image of his ancestor, the zealous rebel fighting against the king, Hotspur, slain in battle, but hearing this comment of Falstaff, fearing, what if he jumps up again like gunpowder and continues the fight? And so I imagine a situation in which Thomas Percy, the descendant of Hotspur, or of Hotspur's family, the Northumbrian Catholic gentleman, imagining himself as a kind of present day, and this would be around the year 1600, incarnation of Hotspur, this time using gunpowder to fight the king. So it's fiction, it's imagined, but it seems like something like that could very easily have happened.
When you read Grace's book, you follow this Thomas Percy through his grappling of his relationship with Hotspur and the connection to the theater, which is really very fun part of her book, while, as she mentions, the book is fictional. It's a very neat trip into the 16th century and what it would have been like to live in London during the age of Shakespeare. So it's quite delightful and an adventure you get to take by reading this. We'll have a link to Grace's book in the show notes for today's episode. Now, Grace, in that same play, Hotspur says, quote, "But for these vile guns, he would himself have been a soldier." Is that an association between guns and the military? I was thinking that handguns might have been seen more as a terrorist weapon in Shakespeare's lifetime, but from what you've mentioned about the military, I'm not sure how ingrained in their standard issue weapons gunpowder and guns really were.
It definitely is a military reference. When Hotspur says that, he's actually not talking about himself. He's making fun of a foppish civilian messenger who confronted him on the battlefield after a battle was concluded, delivering a message from the king. And Hotspur is actually quoting him and making fun of him for not being a soldier, for saying that he would have been a soldier except for these vile guns. So he's ridiculing him. And the reference to guns is real. It's, again, a reference to the big guns, which it's not an anachronistic reference, although I don't exactly know if there were cannons in use in that particular battle that Hotspur is referring to. But basically, he's just making fun of this guy for being afraid of battle, for being afraid of the sound of the big guns. As far as the question of whether guns were exclusively associated with military use or were seen as an agent of terrorism, not an element of terrorism, I would say. I mean, the gunpowder plot was really extraordinary in that way. And even that, it was not using guns. I mean, it was barrels of gunpowder that were stored in the basement of the House of Lords. And they were just going to light it and blow the whole place up, just as gunpowder might be laid under the walls of a city from the late medieval period onward in order to blow up a city. But this was at home. So this is terrorism, people, Englishmen within London trying to do this at home. And so I would say 1605, the time of the gunpowder plot, which it didn't succeed, of course. I mean, they caught them, but that's probably the beginning of the idea that gunpowder could be used as a tool of terrorism. Before that, it's pretty much a battlefield thing. It's pretty much a battlefield reference. And even though, as I said, there were such a thing as handheld guns, mostly they were sort of cumbersome. Even those were things that soldiers hadn't used, and sometimes huntsmen. Pistols existed. They were beginning to be created. They were kind of bulky and weird and large themselves, but they weren't things that people carried around. They certainly weren't the weapon of choice. They aren't what's meant when in Shakespeare arms are referred to. By far the weapon of choice at this time, and everybody had one, or at least every guy had one, would have been a sword and rapier. And the sword and rapier technology was continuing apace as well. These kind of flexible Italian and Spanish swords. That's what's going to be used in a duel, in any kind of private conflict. Ironically, there's even a character in one of Shakespeare's history plays. His name is Pistol, and he's always expressing himself with metaphorical terms drawn from the firing of a pistol, saying, pistol's cock is up and flashing fire will follow, which is kind of a lewd reference, but it's also a reference to the firing mechanism of the pistol. What he means by that is, I'm about to go off. Don't mess with me. I'm about to explode. Yet Pistol, whose name is Pistol, doesn't have a pistol. He has a sword. And so when he's saying, he's waving the sword around. So there's this weird kind of, dualism going on where these gun weaponry existed, but it was more talked about than actually used, and it wasn't the thing that a gentleman was going to carry. In fact, if you're going to use a gun instead of a sword in any conflict, that's pretty base and low down and sneaky. There's no skill required. You can fire from a distance. What the characters in Renaissance drama who actually are toting pistols are very sneaky and low-grade sort of characters. There actually is one in Shakespeare, by the way. There's a character named Thalyard in the late play, the romance Pericles. He goes sneaking around to try and assassinate the hero Pericles with a pistol. And he doesn't succeed. But, a pistol isn't something that Romeo is going to have, with apologies to Baz Luhrmann and Romeo plus Juliet.
Still a good movie. Yeah, we can forgive it.
But it's the dueling culture that's represented in that famous play. Even though you have these metaphorical references to guns going off, none of those guys, not Tybalt, Mercutio, Romeo, they're not going to be using guns. They're swordsmen. They're drawing their rapiers. So again, you have this weird kind of double thing where, there's the thought of guns, but the actuality of swords.
So what about Shakespeare? Where does he himself, the actual William Shakespeare, would he have owned a gun?
If he owned a gun, I would have to say it was some sort of big blunderbuss that he went out and, shot geese with in the Stratford countryside. The idea of Shakespeare or of his contemporaries packing heat is quite anachronistic. So I could believe that Shakespeare owned a sword, but not a gun for casual carrying or use, although it's not beyond the bounds of imagining that he might have hunted with one of those longer guns. Not a pistol. I wouldn't think so.
Not a pistol. Well, we know that he had cannons because that's what burned down the Globe. We know that Shakespeare's Globe burned down due to cannon fire during a production of Henry VIII. What cannon was that they were using in the theater?
Okay, so that's really interesting. So I'm thinking Shakespeare personally isn't going to be toting around a gun, but it's a really interesting question. What sorts of guns were in use in the theater? And the answer is the reason that we know that a cannon was even there and was being used, it was during a very late play that Shakespeare, really the last play that he wrote in collaboration. And there's a ceremonial moment when the play is Henry VIII. There's a ceremonial moment when a gun is fired in salute in a particular scene in the play. And the only reason that we know that it existed is because somehow whatever it was firing set fire to the thatched roof of the playhouse, and the playhouse burnt to the ground. And this was in 1613, I believe. We wouldn't even know that they were actually using a gun to enhance the auditory moment of that scene if it wasn't for that dramatic circumstance. We know it was some sort of cannon, presumably it was kind of a small cannon, and maybe just fired from outside, and somehow the ball went up and set fire to the thatch. But it gives rise to the speculation that Shakespeare might have been using guns, Shakespeare's company might have been using guns, and other playwrights might have, in similar scenes in other plays. So there's all kinds of battle scenes in Shakespeare where you hear that there's alarums, that there's a gun noise or cannon fire off stage. It happens all the time in Henry V, for example. There's lots of battle scenes there. We don't know. I mean, there's no prop lists that say that guns were in use during these scenes, and they could have been using something else. They could have been shaking sheets of metal or rolling cannonballs around, in the upper galleries. But it's quite possible that somebody was firing a cannon, hopefully outside, during the performance of Henry V to bring a note of realism to these battle scenes in the plays. So we know at least that it happened during Henry VIII, even though it wasn't a battle scene. It was just a military salute that was happening during that scene.
This history is so tantalizing with all of its connections between Shakespeare and the history of handguns going on in 16th century England. I know we would love to explore this further. And in addition to reading Gunpowder Percy by Grace Tiffany, which you can get on Amazon, and her other books that she has written, well worth your time, Grace, what are some of your favorite books or resources, maybe even some that you used to write your books, that you could recommend we use to learn more?
Well, the book that helped me the most, the historical research that illuminate my own story the most in Gunpowder Percy, is this wonderful book by Antonia Fraser called Faith and Treason. So it's her account of the gunpowder plot, the 1605 gunpowder plot against James I. That's a wonderful book. There's also a really interesting book by James Shapiro, Shakespearean scholar at Columbia, and it's called 1606. He takes this one year, which was the year, the immediate aftermath of the gunpowder plot, and he views the events of that year through the lens of Shakespeare's reaction to it in various plays. He talks a lot about Macbeth, which has long been known to contain retrospective references to the gunpowder plot, to regicide, and so on. That's a great book, really interesting, 1606 by James Shapiro. And for anyone who's just interested in gunpowder, guns, and their use and technology in the 16th and 17th centuries, there's a great new book by a guy named Bert Hall called Weapons and Warfare in Renaissance Europe. So talking more broadly about the topic of gunpowder technology in Europe.
Those are excellent resources. Thank you so much for those. We'll link to all of these, as well as where you can learn more about Grace, in the show notes for today's episode. That's always casticash.com, followed by the episode number. We ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I'm glad I have all those resources, and interesting to think about having good literary resources at hand now that we're all cooped up at home with libraries closed in our present circumstances. But I would think it would need to be a really long book. And so I think I would choose The Lord of the Rings, which I love. And I'm actually teaching a class in right now. And maybe I could throw The Hobbit in there too. But yeah, I could read The Lord of the Rings a bunch of times.
That's an excellent choice. I think you'd be well set up on your deserted island with your literary choices there. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've actually written a sequel to my first novel, which was about Shakespeare's daughter. The first novel was called My Father Had a Daughter. The sequel, which it's not published yet, but it takes the same character, Shakespeare's youngest daughter, Judith. He had two. And it revisits her as a woman in her early 60s. And she actually lived quite a long time. She lived into her late 70s. But it comes back and tells her story in the middle of the 17th century during the time of the English Civil War, and kind of picks up her adventures at that point. It just follows her as she involves herself in various ways with major players and sometimes minor players in the war situation of that time. And it's called The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter, which is a quotation from Hamlet, which makes no sense until you actually start reading the book and see how it connects. So basically, that's what it is. It's a sequel to My Father Had a Daughter, but taking it in this later time, mid-17th century, about a generation after Shakespeare's death.
That's absolutely fascinating. Cannot wait to read that. And we'll put links where you can find this in today's show notes as well. Grace, thank you so much for being here. This was really fun conversation. I've enjoyed looking at handguns and cannons and exploring this history with you today. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
To really dive into the history of Shakespeare and guns and the gunpowder plot that was happening during his lifetime, as well as to connect with Grace Tiffany and see some of the links to her novels, and she's written several that are worth checking out, go to the show notes. The show notes for each episode here at That Shakespeare Life are packed with extra history, links to information on our guest, and more information about, of course, William Shakespeare. Find all the good stuff at CassidyCash.com/episode 105. That's CassidyCash.com/EP105. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right. That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available. And not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.